Prime Minister, ministers, ladies and gentlemen,
Monsieur le Président du Conseil constitutionnel,
President of the Constitutional Court, members of
Monsieur le
Parliament,
chef d'état-major des armées,
Chief of Staff, Mr. Lenonce,
Mesdames et
Your
Messieurs les
Highness,
ambassadrices et ambassadeurs, Mesdames, Messieurs les directrices et
Excellencies,
directeurs,
ambassadors,
Mesdames et Messieurs en vos grades de
heads of
qualité,
departments,
chers amis.
all protocols included,
Je suis
dear
heureux de
friends,
vous accueillir
I'm
une nouvelle fois à l'Élysée à l'occasion
delighted
de
to
la
welcome
30e
you
conférence
here once
des
again
ambassadrices et des
on the occasion
ambassadeurs.
of the 30th Conference of
Je
Ambassadors.
veux bien sûr vous remercier pour le
And
travail
I
accompli
should like
cette
to
année.
thank you for the fine
Remercier le
work
ministre
accomplished
de l'Europe et des
last
Affaires
year. I
étrangères,
would like to thank the
les
Minister
ministres
for Europe
délégués,
and Foreign
le
Affairs,
secrétaire général, les
delegate
directrices et
ministers,
directeurs, les agents
Secretary
des centres de
General,
soutien,
and the
l'ensemble des agents
agents in
où qu'ils servent, à Paris, à Nantes
special units
ou à l'étranger.
all over the country,
Je veux
Paris,
aussi, bien sûr,
Nantes, and
remercier
indeed abroad. I
nos
should like to
militaires,
thank
nos fonctionnaires, de tous les autres
our
ministères qui
servicemen,
servent aussi chacun dans leur
our
rôle
civil servants, and all those who, working in our ministries, are serving our country.
Je sais
at home
vos
and
efforts au
abroad.
service direct de nos
I know you've
compatriotes,
been
votre engagement pour la promotion de
making
nos
great
intérêts
efforts to protect our
idées,
fellow
nos
citizens, our ideas, our
avec le
values,
concours
our
de
interests,
l'ensemble des opérateurs sur le terrain.
with the help of all operators on the ground. My thoughts go out with great gratitude for all those who help build the image of France around the world, its prestige, its attractiveness, especially French expatriates who, with their talents and with the help of their elected officials, but also entrepreneurs, journalists, scientists, and many others, are contributing to the image of our country. We are meeting in January rather than in September. We were right after the Olympic Games. That was, of course, a sporting triumph, but also a cultural event where France was able to project its positive image around the world. The Olympic Games also was an opportunity to help the country shine around the world. And meeting with you here in January is an opportunity to extend my best wishes to you and your families. Your families, of course, are very much involved in your missions, and indeed for all those who are serving the country. On 31st December, I expressed my wishes to my fellow citizens. This is the turn of a quarter century, the opening of an era which was not necessarily that which we had expected. In the year 2000, we thought this was going to be a foregone conclusion, democracy, the end of conflicts, but 25 years down the road, we find that what we thought, what we took for granted in the year 2000, didn't really pan out. We find chaos around the world, and there's a new demand for diplomats, yourselves, the closed ones. And this is why I say that I know the people I'm talking to, the men and women well aware of the requirements of the job, do meet these exacting requirements in Kiev, in Beirut, in Tel Aviv, Ouagadougou, Bamako, Port-au-Prince, Caracas. Every day of the past few months, diplomats had to show strength and courage at a time when serving the country was a dangerous job indeed. You need courage because of the sound and fury of the world, because of all these disorders. 25 years after the year 2000, but even 10 years later, we find that what was unthinkable back then is actually happening. We find disorders because of the weakening of international rules, challenged by other powers that are not going by the rules, new international confrontations, countries that are trying to fragment the world to their own interest. 10 years ago, and I would like to pay tribute to French diplomacy back then, and the minister at the time, we achieved the Paris agreements on climate. Such an achievement would be unthinkable today. The disorders in democracies, the challenging of the promises of prosperity, social climbing, all these ideals are being destabilized by these powers. A few weeks ago, Romania had to cancel an election because of electoral interference clearly attributed to Russia. Who would have thought that 10 years ago? France itself was challenged by unacceptable interference overseas, in its overseas territories, especially in New Caledonia, where Azerbaijan thought it could address its own issues because we, on our side, were supporting Armenia. Who would have thought that 10 years ago? 10 years ago, when we were told that the owners of one of the largest social media in the world would be supporting a reactionary new international movement and interfering with public affairs in Germany. Who would have thought that possible? And yet it is happening. We find disorders in technological developments that are challenging our ways of life, challenging our very histories, at a time where states can be overcome by private powers, non-state actors. Technological innovations provide good developments for our daily lives. Space science, biology, many aspects of technology do carry positive developments. But there are global disorders as well. Global warming is a case in point. We can see the consequences from Spain to Mayotte. Social inequalities, divergence in development, which are, of course, the ground for crime, illegal migration, terrorism. And so the world I'm describing here, and I've had many opportunities to describe this world over the past few years, this world is marked by ominous developments, the return of imperial powers and pressures, the very violent challenging of humanism. And so there's a triple disruption: strategic, technological, and political, philosophical. It is the mirror image of our Renaissance, with a very simple question in this Renaissance: which are the nations coming through? Those obeying the rules of the older world, or those that have understood that you have to keep realistic and maintain your ideals? So you need moral strength, but strength by itself. You need to pull out, in many respects, of a form of naivete or uses that are still currency in our countries. And a few months ago, I made this comparison with herbivores and carnivores. Those that are applying the rules that other powers no longer apply will be devoured. And yet, being strong is good only if you serve your ideals and the principles to which you subscribe. This is the main difference with the authoritarian forces coming through. And so this coming out of innocence should go along with the form of proactivity. You have to reconsider transatlantic links and bonds, the need to read the world as it is and things as they are. And so, speaking before you today, I'm well aware that I do this. I speak to high-level diplomats who have sincere concerns and questions, but also at the time where our own fellow countrymen have similar questions and concerns. Reading the papers, you think everything is going down the drain. Democracy was yesterday's ideal. Everybody seems to be fascinated by a new order which seems to be challenging all the rules, so much so that you wonder if it's even worth fighting. But very much so it is well worth fighting, and we do have weapons to do this. The first question in many people's minds, and reading the papers you find a defeatist attitude, is France still in a position to defend its policies? Well, we have a clear and sound constitution, our choices are crystal clear, and our assets remain our assets. French assets haven't disappeared overnight. Our diplomatic clout around the world, the echo of our own language and case in point with the recent summit of Francophonie, which we hosted. These are strengths for the country. We have the strength of our culture. You can see the whole world that came to see our rebuilt Notre Dame Cathedral. And France was very much present in international events. The Olympic and Paralympic Games is another example. And it is essential for the French to realize that the world is looking upon the country. We have the wherewithal to move forward. This base of common cultural and history is our strength, as is our strength our industrial, technological, academic capability. We have redeployed our assets for the nation to strengthen our diplomatic and military presence, and I know that the Prime Minister's intention is to pursue this course and continue reasoning along the same lines. We're investing in diplomacy. People are criticizing France because the powers that be were not up to their expectations. But back then, when they were in positions of power, why did they not defend the budget to that end? In fact, we have been investing in diplomacy. We have increased the budget of the ministry, the number of jobs in the diplomatic corps. We have been even more involved in international events. We are addressing the challenges of the time with new methods, new practices, new efforts of communication, and indeed influence. This is indispensable if we are to pursue this course. And on this, I count on you, ambassadors, and I myself came in March to express this at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're also investing in our armed forces, and I will renew my wishes for the new year on the 20th of January. In the new military law, we will double our military budget in 10 years. No other country has done the same, and we haven't waited until 2022 to make this happen. We've also been investing in our societal efforts. These investments of solidarity have increased 50%. In absolute numbers, we had an increase of 10.3, well, from 10.3 till 15.2 billion. Who has done the same? We have become the fourth largest contributor to OECD. We've created 48 French alliances. Now we have 835 around the world. So we're not giving up on the network. 150,000 new students have been accepted in the network of French schools. There are 600,000 such students around the world. No other country can boast such a performance. And indeed, we have the International City of French Language at Villers-Cotterêts. We have the City of Development that we're building in Paris, the House of African World that we will be, the foundations of which will be laid in 2025. These are investments by the nation in what is a challenging context, but we are committed to this, and I should like to thank the Prime Minister and his ministers for continuing down this roadmap. This is a cultural investment, as it is also a military and a strategic investment, but will Europe be able to afford these policies? Here in Paris, we have the concern that things are going from bad to worse, but back 8 years ago, we had the same concerns. President Trump was elected 8 years ago. Everybody was scared. President Trump has been re-elected now, and everybody seems to be scared. But hey, France has always been working for European sovereignty. We were told this will never happen. It's all very well to talk, but this is a European discourse. You find this at the heart of the European Commission. European defense, people would dismiss, saying this is a French fantasy. There's nothing else but NATO. But nobody now is challenging the European pillar of NATO, and indeed all the instruments that we have set up over the past few years. The common debt, that again was seen as utopia, madness even. And yet, in 2020, during COVID, there was a Franco-German agreement to address the situation. If you decide to lose the battle, of course you will lose the battle. But if there's a common determination to move forward, you can do this. And we've done this over the past 7 years. Europe has moved forward, and now we're in a position to address the challenges ahead. And indeed, we've given a new momentum to our relations within Europe, with Germany, of course, with the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty, which has strengthened our bilateral relations. We have similar treaties with Spain and Italy, and we are moving forward to a similar treaty with Poland that will be signed in Nancy in the spring, and indeed a strategic alliance with Greece. We've taken bold initiatives. Europe is both our duty and our opportunity. We have to keep this community program and agenda. We have to strengthen bilateral relations around the country, around the continent. I went through all the capitals in my first term, and I will do this as well during the second term. There should be no fatigue in front of these diplomatic efforts. We shouldn't be defeatist. Europe has a position. We should give it an ambition. And the third and simple question, will President Trump's election bring about more uncertainty? Well, for the same reasons, I think we have to be relatively cautious. From 2020 to 2024, France was able to work with President Trump. We know that there are areas of disagreement, climate, the international order, but I also find that the first visit abroad of the president-elect was here in Paris. And there were new discussions that started at Notre Dame. But if we are defeatist, there's no way we can be respected in President Trump's United States of America. So let us see the choices of the American people and understand the consequences. President Trump knows that France is a sound ally, believing in Europe, self-confident, with a clear ambition for the transatlantic relation, but a clear and candid ambition. We know how things are. Since 2011, successive American presidents have been keeping the same narrative. Their priority is the United States of America, followed by relations with China. And so Europe is another position, and we have to be clear about this and respecting this fact and be consistent. Having addressed these three questions of the day, being proactive and determined, seeing the situation as it is, but with the will to being bold and with the clear policies for our fellow countrymen. Here again, I would like to define, as it were, a roadmap for the next year. We have to build France's security for the French. French and European prosperity is an existential issue, and I've spoken about this already. A few months ago, I mentioned this at the Sorbonne speech. And then we have to have our values gain international status. This has been our priority as well. But of course, security is first and foremost, especially facing the terrorist risk. And of course, in this week where we will be marking the 10th anniversary of the attacks against Charlie Hebdo and the Hypercacher Jewish store, 10 years ago we had the Paris terrorist attacks. Over the past 10 years, we've carried the fight against terrorism, doing remarkable work, thanks to all the security services, the intelligence departments, the gendarmes, our judges, to address the threat and ensure the safety and security of our fellow citizens. We've created new laws, rules and regulations, but we've given ourselves new ways and means to address this threat. But this threat was not just within our borders, but outside our borders as well, in the Levant, in the Sahel. And I would like here to pay tribute to our diplomats, our servicemen, who were very much involved over the past 10 years. In the Sahel, we managed to prevent the advent of a territorial caliphate that would have threatened France and its interests. It is thanks to the French military that this was made possible, and we keep working as part of the Isolde operation against terrorism in the Levant. And that is also an exemplary commitment I would also like to point out. At the time when we have been here in Europe badly hit by terrorism, and you had the Magdeburg attack in Germany or in the United States. There were the attacks in New Orleans. Terrorism is a real risk. It is still very much present in our societies. And this means that there should be no giving up, no relenting.
Il ne faut donc aucun répit dans la lutte contre le terrorisme et je demande évidemment à tout le gouvernement de continuer à être mobilisé, le ministre de l'Intérieur au premier chef.
The whole government is committed to this. With the Minister of the Interior, under the authority of the Prime Minister, we have to act as a bloc and we have to continue to do this internationally. In the Middle East, we have to be very clear-minded about the change of regime in Syria. I'll be going back on this. And it's from there that the attacks were organized on our soil in 2015, and in the Levant, in the Sahel, and in other regions of the world where terrorist groups are organizing. We must continue, we must remain extremely vigilant, we must mobilize our whole network, the whole of our security services from the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. We know that the terrorist threat is growing, so the threat is not behind us, quite the contrary, and our role, your role, is continue to have this in mind, uppermost in our minds, to continue this work of vigilance, and we must continue to form useful alliances to combat these groups, and I'll be going back on that as well. Now, the war in the Middle East are not far and distant conflicts, and I wish to dwell on this particular theatres. We talk about security. Now, we're talking about the security of our people and of the seismic changes that are underway, and that's why our solidarity with Israel in combating the barbaric attacks that were that were launched by Hamas in October 2023. Our solidarity is complete. All the hostages held in Gaza must be immediately released, and we must continue to work for the release of our compatriots who are still held hostage. So we must work so that the security of Israel's citizens must be fully guaranteed, and that is why, consistent with our long-standing friendship with Israel, we continue to display our solidarity. And this was also the case when attacks were launched by the Iranians and the Houthis, and we continue to play our full role in establishing a ceasefire along the blue borderline for the establishment of a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. Now, with the targeted attacks by Israel against Lebanon and Iran have changed the whole situation, we must continue to strive towards a lasting peace for all in the region. That peace cannot be built with purely a security-based approach. It has to involve humanitarian political work as a precondition. First of all, in Gaza, there is no military justification for continuing military operations by Israel, by the hindering of humanitarian operations and the state of extreme distress of the Palestinian population. In 2023, France immediately called for a ceasefire, and we held the first humanitarian conference in support of this effort. This remains our priority in conjunction with our partners in the region and to support all the whole population. Beyond that, Israel must end the war. It must recognize that it has partners for peace, and in coordination with all the countries in the region regarding Gaza, by preserving political conditions on the West Bank and in Gaza in order to build a Palestinian state, and by working with the countries in the region and with the international community to enable there to be a two-state solution with peaceful coexistence. Peace is possible. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates have committed to this approach, and France continues to fully support this. And I wish that Europe also act in order to implement the two-state solution while ensuring full security for the State of Israel and the right of the Palestinians to coexist. And we need cooperation in the Middle East. This is the very purpose of the international conference that we have launched with Saudi Arabia, which will be held in June of this year. And this will have to be a decisive moment, and it is with this goal that we can move towards the goal of a state of Palestine. Our commitment remains full to Lebanon, with which we have such close ties, with which there is such a long history. We will continue to support the restoring peace along the blue line with the peacekeeping force and to enable the Lebanese army to fully deploy with the mechanism for supervision of the ceasefire. And it's the efforts of the United States and France that enabled this ceasefire to be obtained. Nobody thought this was possible even a few weeks ago. We are committed to this whole process and to the supervision mechanism. And there also, this is a source of pride for France. It reflects our determination. We must continue to work with humility, with determination. I wish to thank all our military forces who engage with the peacekeeping force, and we have to succeed with the political process. Jean-Yves Le Drian is contributing his good offices. He has been there on the ground, and we wish that among the Lebanese political forces that a Lebanese president be elected on the session of the 9th of January, because this is the only way for there to be full Lebanese sovereignty, which will lead to the establishment of government that will be able to take through the necessary reforms. France has also been very clear-minded here. We worked to achieve a ceasefire, and we will be there over time to ensure the success of this transition. Now, in Syria, let us be proud of the fact that we never succumbed to this delusion that the dictator could be rehabilitated. We worked for a free, sovereign Syria. As early as 2011, we will be loyal to our allies in combating the Islamist forces. We have a debt of gratitude to the democratic forces in Syria, including the Kurds, who in those very difficult years were brave enough to combat terrorist forces. And we did not turn our backs on them in 2018, and we will not do so now. We're very watchful on the political process that is just beginning. The Minister for Foreign Affairs and European Affairs went to Damascus a few days ago, and he recalled our expectations, which is to reintegrate all the components to ensure the return of refugees, to continue to fight against terrorism, to dismantle all the production structures of chemical weapons and the network of narcotic production. And we want this to contribute to regional stability, and we will be holding the third Baghdad conference in the spring to come up with new concrete projects at regional level in the interest of all, with the goal of peace and security. So our agenda, both in Iraq and Syria, is based on the upholding the sovereignty of each of these countries and on a pluralist model, which will enable this. But looking beyond these crises, what we can see is that the challenge we're facing in the region and beyond is Iran. Iran is the main security strategic challenge in the region for France, and well beyond. The acceleration of its nuclear program brings us to breaking point. Its ballistic capabilities are a threat to Europe. Iran is already involved in Russia's war against Ukraine with a fully affirmed support to Russia. It supports dangerous groups on all the theaters in the Middle East. It's attempting to deploy in Africa, which further increases this threat through proxies. And it's fully assuming its role as a supporter of terrorism. The Iranian issue is one of the key issues on we will be engaging the dialogue with the new American administration. And France's vision here has been consistent since 2018. Just remember when the Americans decided to renounce the JCPOA, which they themselves have promoted, France's view was very clear. We had to go towards a broader agreement. That's our policy now. Iran is a risk, a threat, if we leave it beyond the framework. And on the issue of the nuclear program, on the ballistic program, on regional destabilization, we need to have an overall discussion, and we need to be able to come up with verifiable, irreversible solutions, which requires that we engage with the American administration and all the main countries in the region. Europe is credible because it is consistent in this regard. This is France with our main partners. We have not departed from our approach. We were more demanding even before the 2015 agreements. We contributed to making them tougher, and in the months ahead we will be we're ready to establish these sanction mechanisms once again between now and October. We need a broader engagement in order to have a more demanding treatment, the treaty, and this I think is one of the key issues of our strategic discussions with the United States of America and other countries in the region. Now, I've just been talking about Iran. Another key security challenge is, of course, Russia. Russia through the war with Ukraine and beyond. And there again, I know there's a certain weariness that emerges, weariness of support for Ukraine, doubts that dispel goodwill, questioning of the meaning, the purpose of our aid. I've heard many comments in recent months that with the arrival of President Trump that aid will fade away. Now, we're trying to be consistent, and we are committed in a diplomatic battle. France organized the first exchange between President-elect Trump and President Zelensky here in Paris, which enabled us to identify all the challenges that are playing out, the reality of the conflict on the ground, and the need to contribute answers that will probably take a little bit longer than was initially expected, which is a good thing. Now, what I want to say here is why what is happening in Ukraine is so important, because it concerns international security and the immediate interest of Europe and France, because what we're seeing is uninhibited revisionism, imperialism. If we see internationally recognized borders, international law thwarted, and the response being that it's too expensive, too difficult to uphold. If we accept this, well, good luck for what will follow, because that will simply mean that the credibility of everybody will be take a very severe knock. It'll affect everybody's credibility. In recent years, Russia has stepped up its aggressiveness, and it's changed the very nature of its aggressiveness towards the Europeans and other parts of the globe. A radical change in Russia's behavior in terms of nuclear doctrine, which has been made far tougher, and it's a much more aggressive attitude towards its neighboring countries. We see this in Armenia, where Russia, by changing suddenly its alliance, switching alliances to become an ally of Azerbaijan, simply because the Armenians were standing up to them. In Georgia, through destabilizing the electoral process, stuffing the ballot boxes. In Moldova, where they tried the same thing, and they failed, and I wish to commend the courage and determination of President Bayosandu. But we still have the general elections there. And I could also talk about the Romanian elections, where Russia had no hesitation in manipulating the electoral process in an EU member state. And Russia, through its many attempts, has threatened the European soil, displaying its capacity to reach Europe with advanced technology through cyber attacks, and it has de facto decided to globalize the Ukrainian conflict. There's only one country engaged in escalation in Ukraine, that's Russia, and it's involving Iran, as I was saying, with the production of military components, and with many Chinese components on dual-use equipment, and de facto by involving North Korea in the conflict. Who could have imagined that North Korea, looking back 5 years ago, that North Korea would be involved in a conflict on European soil? But that's where we are. So in a few semesters, the very nature of the conflict has been completely transformed, and that is Russia's entire responsibility. And what we were saying in last February here is even truer now. As Europeans, we cannot let Russia win in Ukraine for the international order, for our own security. We cannot possibly allow this to happen. So it's not a matter of deciding whether it's this or that. No, it's deciding how we're going to organize things to enable us to hold over time, to enable the Ukrainians to negotiate peace on the best possible terms, and to also enable to find the ways and the resources to contain the Russian threat, which is a threat to the whole of Europe. So there be no illusion. There cannot be any easy, fast solution in Ukraine. The new American president knows that they cannot win anything if Ukraine loses. And let me be very clear here. No solution should be found in Ukraine without the Ukrainians. There cannot be any solution for security in Europe without the Europeans, and no fast solution that would entail surrender of Ukraine can possibly be a good thing for Europe and the United States. Now, once you've got those simple principles in mind, then we have to establish the resources to be able to resist, to be in the best possible negotiating position, and the United States should help us to change the nature of the situation, to persuade Russia to come to the negotiating table. The Ukrainians have made realistic proposals on territorial matters. Only they can wage these negotiations. The Europeans will have to build a solution here which will be Europe's responsibility, because it's a geographical and geopolitical response. And all this leads, when you look at what's going on, what we see is that we have a very deep change in strategy, war in Europe. Russia has completely transformed. Its military industry is producing as much as the whole of Europe. We've talked about the war economy in Europe, but we're very, very far from what we should be doing.
As Europeans, all our efforts in the defense industry are dwarfed by Russia's efforts. The United States is stepping up its own efforts. It has a declared ambition. China has an arsenal of its own, and we can't compete with that Chinese stockpile. But France has its own assets. I mean, at least we anticipated that transformation. We've been reinvesting ever since 2019 in the defense industry, but clearly there's an acceleration, a transformation of the threat, a deep change in the strategic environment, which is now proliferating. It's uninhibited. It is going overboard. in the space industry, the naval, all aspects of the defense industry are developing around the world. France is building its own military. It has its own innovation strategy. We have NATO, which has to adjust to new threats in the Euro-Atlantic theater without going beyond that, because it has to focus its efforts. And indeed, our assets should be made more robust. What we were able to do in France and in Europe, this European defense pillar, is all very well, but still not enough. We have to go further and faster and stronger. And on many of these strategic directions, we were right, but still the acceleration and the transformation of the threat is such that we have to strengthen our own position, go further. And so the strategic compass, the determination to engage on an industrial and technological defense space, the European intervention, our ambitious industrial program, all this was necessary, but we need to go one step further. We need to have a massive European investment program, and we have to declare a clear European preference. As we talk of the Oedipus program, the issue is not whether we should have this that ceiling or threshold like we said 10 years ago. The issue today is to see whether Europeans for the next 20 years want to produce what will be necessary for their security. And there's a lot to believe that the United States will have its own defense, and the American defense will more concern the China seas than the confines of Europe. If we solely rely on the on the American technological base, we are in for sore disappointments. And we cannot rely on the rest of the world. We have to build our own capabilities. We've started doing this with our European friends, with Germany, with the UK, the Italian initiative, ELSA, but we need more ambition, and we need to have a clear European preference in our programs. We need to go much further on the European scale. We have to invest much more within the European Union, and we have to show more ambition in the European political community. This has got to be a place of defense cooperation, because this is European-wide. It is definitely not the same message, the same vocabulary as NATO. The political European community was devised by France 10 years ago, and it is now moving forward to include the Britons, the Ukrainians, the Moldavians, the Balkans, the Norwegians. These are countries that are facing the same strategic issues and challenges, even though they may not sit in the same political venues. They are joined by a political community, and they are facing the same challenges, even though they do not belong to the same organizations. And talking about security, I should like to say something about immigration. We have to protect the French. We have to protect our borders if we are to protect our people. We mentioned this before, and I would like to mention this again. Europe, over the past 10 years, has been pushed around because of migration events. It had a major political crisis. Several countries found it difficult to cooperate, but now we have the wherewithal, we have the instruments, we need the political will that would enable us to address the challenge. Under the French presidency of the Union, we restarted the European dialogue on asylum and immigration. We took the initiative of a gradual approach, which pulled us out of the crisis with which we were blocked. The Immigration Compact is a major step forward for Europe. This is our way to address the challenge. Instead of having a hypocritical system where some were left holding the receiving end, now everybody has a role to play, and instead of posturing, we recognize that asylum has to be dealt with seriously, addressing the issues of criminality, hiding behind asylum requests. So we have to have a clear system, not just to let people in, but also to expel people who do not belong. That is what the immigration compact is all about. We have to have provisions on returning illegal aliens, and we have to have European cooperation on this to protect the borders of the European Union. Now, that European response under the stewardship of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, this will be France's voice in European at European level. We need to have a proactive approach. Very often one mentions the innovative approaches proposed in Europe, but such innovative approaches are not in line with European principles or European laws. But if anything works, of course, we'd pick it up. But what has worked in Europe is what I just mentioned, a European cooperative demanding approach. That will work. But nationalistic approaches do not work, especially for France, Germany, Italy, or Spain, which are, these countries are no islands. They very much depend on cooperation with neighboring countries. And so what does work, what does give results, is a European approach, a more demanding approach, protecting the borders. We have to monitor immigration and secondary migration flows within Europe, and also having a better dialogue with origination countries. It's not a matter of sending people back to countries they have never seen. We're not there to carry out threats on the international scene. That doesn't work. Our ministers have been working day and night to protect the French, using the legislative arsenal. But we have to be more demanding of ourselves. We have to be more consistent. We have to listen to the French. Their demands, their expectations are common sense. We want to have a better integration. We have to be able better to receive people coming to our country. But our people simply do not understand that at a time when we have dangerous people on our territory, we want to expel them, and then we can't. And yet, in return, we are providing visas without without any counterpart. That goes against common sense. So, of course, a radical, a blind method doesn't work very well. We've seen this in a number of countries. We have to be clear about this. We need to have a very precise, rigorous commitment, but we have to be much more demanding with the origination countries so that they should in turn cooperate with our policies. This is happening under the authority of our Prime Minister, of our Foreign Minister, and indeed our Home Secretary will all need to cooperate on these issues. Embassies, consulates, and indeed our Home Department will be working. You may remember the Hermelin report listed the clear directions we should follow. We need to have clear expectations, a clear objective. Our consular policy has to be revisited. We need to see exactly what results we want to achieve. We have to have a targeted approach. It's not a matter of targeting binational citizens who are contributing to the economy and society. But with consular authorities, we need to have a clear policy. We cannot accept a situation when there's no cooperation. And so I'm expecting of you great commitment. You have to be demanding. Still, of course, we want to be an attractive country. We want to be able to choose our immigration. We need to have a clear, proactive policy in terms of development assistance. But nonetheless, we have to know what is what, and we have to be able to speak clearly when our counterparts are not playing by the rules. Then we have to be firm. That work is indispensable, and I know that the French government is very much committed to this. Over and beyond the issue of migration, we will continue our efforts fighting organized crime, drug trafficking. Of course, we need cooperation on an international scale. The second line of action, the second priority, and there again I have great expectations of us all, is prosperity, France's economic growth. European economic growth. We've said a lot about this already. One thing is for sure, Europe has worked hard over the past few years to reform itself, but it is facing a risk of falling behind the United States, China, the Draghi reports, the many reports by prominent economists have identified the problems. We have all sorts of figures, but one figure speaks for itself. In 25 years' time, American GDP grew twice as much as European GDP per capita. And the United States is in a better position in terms of investment than Europe on green technologies, artificial intelligence, and the defense industry. Now, of course, you could be defeatist and say that's the end of it, there's nothing we can do, we might as well buy American. And it is true that if you look at behaviors, and it is actually happening. But again, there is no fatality there. We can certainly much address this. We are the continent with the greatest savings, and we have to either go for our own resources or go to China. France's choice is to say, we've created a common market. It shouldn't just be the triumph of consumers. This is a great demographic strength. We have 450 million inhabitants. The United States has got 350 million. But people see this as a method of adjustment. We just might as well buy American for the defense industry. That gives us the American umbrella. Or we'll buy Chinese technology because that will put us in good terms with China. But there's no reason to stick to these ideas. If you realize that sovereignty is essential, well, then we have to be very clear about European prosperity. That's the only way, in fact, the Americans or the Chinese will respect us. Indeed, the emerging economies. But if we say exactly the opposite of what they're doing at home, we will be considered as the big naive of history. We'll be people who are already on the way out. We are growing old, we're producing less energy, we're buying it, we're paying more for it. And then they're saying, well, on top of that, they're being nice. No, being nice is not a job, and this is not the way we'll build our future. So we need to have a European strategy, we need to have a French strategy. Europe's strategy is quite simple, and that will be the agenda for 2025. In 2025, many things will happen with the new European Commission. European states have a key role to play because, of course, it all starts at the Council of at the European Council, and of course with my counterparts, we will move forward to address the big challenges. And the number one thing in our European strategy is simplification. We have a real issue, and there we have to recognize this. We can only blame ourselves for this. Europe has fallen behind the rest of the world, albeit with the best of intentions, because we are investing less, we're doing less, but we're producing more legislation. That won't do. And in all areas, we produce excess legislation, and so we have to revisit the European regulatory agenda. And all these new forms of legislation were brought about with the best of intentions. We ourselves were involved in this. But at some point, we have to be able to suspend legislation until such time as we have found the ability to compete with our competitors. Otherwise, we'll be completely wiped out. And simplification is not just cleaning up legislation. There should be a legislative pause, a standstill, until such time as we can revisit our ability to innovate. But that means looking very clearly at where we stand and what we need to do. And that is a demand we need to have vis-à-vis ourselves. On simplification, the second aspect is the single market. We have to get it through to arrive at a domestic market for our companies. We have a source of growth which doesn't cost a penny, and that is lifting barriers between countries. And so those areas where it works, we should accelerate this. If we want our own startups, our giants in artificial intelligence, if we want them to be in the international scene, we want to make sure that their domestic market shouldn't be the French market, but the European market. And that means deepening the European market, and that is key to the digital economy, to the power industry, to telecoms. we have to, in a way, break the previous rules and have a harmonized system. We have to step up the energy market, the single market for energy, for electronic components. At this point, we're paying a high price for our lack of competitiveness in terms of energy and electricity, whereas even though we have a big nuclear base in Europe, we don't know how to communicate or to exchange, to trade our own energies, and so we end up with high prices.
C'est de repenser le commerce. Je le disais tout à l'heure, parce que nous avons été trop naïfs.
We have been too naive, so rethinking trade is being able to protect ourselves and ensuring fairness in trade. In September 2023, when I addressed you here, I was upholding this. We're talking about Chinese electric vehicles, and I was talking about the different tariffs between Europe and China. And I fully support what the Commission did on electric vehicles. That was a very strong signal. Now we'll continue to support our producers who have suffered retaliation, and on, for example, on the cognac, I want to thank Jean-Pierre Raffarin, who was used his good offices here, and will continue to make progress on this. But we're right to do that. If there's no fairness in trade, then we cannot produce competitively in Europe. Now, this is simply what the Chinese and the Americans are doing for themselves. So Europe is becoming part of this, these dynamics, and we have to continue to defend European content in our production. It's not enough just on electric vehicles. Otherwise, what we have to uphold in each aspect of the value chains, not just electric vehicles, but we have to uphold the capacity to produce European goods. Now, this is not a crypto-Marxist approach. It's not contrary to the rules of international trade. It's simply what the United States of America have been doing for many, many years. And it's just that we in Europe have not wanted to do that. And at the very time when the WTO rules are not respected neither by China nor the United States of America, we continue to respect those rules all by ourselves. Now, that doesn't work. Let's wake up, look at what's being done. We have to uphold our trade policy, and we have to ensure that we have a proper level of competitiveness based on fairness, and we have to uphold European content. That's absolutely essential. We have to be consistent. We have to have a European agenda, in a trade agenda that's consistent with our regulatory and climate agenda. In other words, we have to implement close mirror measures that enable us to implement this agenda. For example, looking at agriculture, we cannot ban certain phytosanitary products and at the same time enter into trade agreements where there's no ban on this. If you try to explain this to the man in the street, it just doesn't work. And that's why France upheld, for example, the CTA, the agreement with Chile and New Zealand, because they have mirror measures, safeguarding measures that enable things to be adjusted in the event of imbalance. But given the information that we've had on the Mercosur, these mechanisms, these provisions simply aren't there. There's those safeguarding clauses if some markets are destabilized, and there are no mirror clauses. So now, we've just reached the signing stage for those who think that France is disappearing from the scene simply because the Commission has signed the trade. Now, having been here for a while, I'm able to stand back here, and I was a witness at the Osaka G20 signing of the Mercosur, which was swept away because those who'd signed it didn't respect it. This was the beginning of Mr. Bolsonaro's term of office. So it's not all over yet, far from it, and we'll continue to energetically defend our commitments, and that means a consistent trade policy, and the Europeans need to look at their national security policies. The American approach should be a source of inspiration. We need to look at the Chinese approach. We cannot. There's so many sectors when there's the mobility of technology-assisted vehicles. Now, this concerns national security. It enables them to control access to their market of electric vehicles and some assistance devices. Now, if this works for the Americans, maybe it can work for the Europeans. So we need to look at this more closely, and we need an innovative industrial policy. We need to simplify things. We need to have a different trade policy that protects us and a different policy in terms of industrial innovation. Now, over the past 7 years, we've transformed things. Industrial policy was a dirty word in Europe. The first term of office of Ursula von der Leyen, with the remarkable help of Thierry Breton, we launched an industrial policy in Europe with fuel cells, hydrogen. We had results, and we need to go further with high-tech, artificial intelligence. We need to have a more determined policy and much more ambitious policy. And in this regard, France will be hosting on the 11th and 12th of February the Artificial Intelligence Summit, a summit for action. Now, this summit will enable us to have an international discussion on artificial intelligence. Prime Minister Modi will be there immediately after a state visit to our country. And this will enable us to have a dialogue with all the powers in IA, America, China, but major nations such as India, which have a role to play, as well as the Gulf states. Now, looking beyond what we want to do in the public interest through a foundation that we're going to be establishing on a host of issues that we will be going back on. The heart of the summit will be our ability to draw talent, to put the French and the Europeans back at the heart of artificial intelligence in terms of training, investment, and across all segments of the value chain in IA. We have a role to play, but in order to do so, we need to invest more, and we need to be able to continue to train people. We have many strengths, but we need to bolster this. So we have to mobilize the whole of our diplomatic network for this IA summit in February. We have to have the ability to contribute the European and French vision in the years ahead. Now, the fourth area of this axis is investment and budget. We can only do all this by investing far more. So the budget matter has to be settled here and now. We need more of our own resources. We need to be able to borrow on the markets. And the Europeans as a whole have to be investing more together. What we need is European capacity to invest in priority areas: green industry, defense, artificial intelligence, and it basically means doubling the budget. And that's what we did during the pandemic. And in a way, the challenge is different, but the size of the challenge is very similar. So we need to better mobilize European savings. We're the continent that has the most savings, but it's poorly allocated. And this means that we have to reform European capital markets. We need to have a Europe for savings and investment, and this is one of the key areas for the next few months in Europe. This strategy for European prosperity has to be consolidated through a French strategy. First of all, through macroeconomic policies. We have increased our appeal. We've lowered unemployment. The Prime Minister wants to consolidate the supply policy, and we'll be talking about this in the next few days in his policy statement. We need to consolidate our attractiveness with Choose France. In May, we'll have a new issue of Choose France. It will be a major event, and I want to thank all the stakeholders here, Business France, Team Export, as we say in good French, with all our networks that are mobilizing, because we have to continue to attract investment across all sectors, and we need to increase the attractiveness in France. And this is part of serving French prosperity and the whole of our French territory through this policy of attractiveness. And through your mobilization in recent years, we've been able to create tens of thousands of jobs in all regions of France. And every year I've been to witness this, and there hasn't been one single region that in France that has been left out of this. So macroeconomic policy based on supply and growth, a strategy for attractiveness, ensuring the safety of our supplies, and we have a policy for rare resources. We're deploying this policy in many of the countries where you are based. There are still capacities that have not been tapped that will enable us to ensure the security of all our sectors. Now, if we want a more independent France, a France that is going to rise to these major challenges in the years ahead, we need to have cobalt, uranium, lithium. We need to ensure access to these resources, and this is very much part of the diplomatic strategy that began some years ago in facing Chinese aggressiveness. We've started this with our policy in Mongolia, for example, which is unprecedented, which is bringing some results now. My visit to Mongolia, the agreement on this further visit was presented in December to Parliament, and in many other areas, including Africa, we have a policy to implement regarding rare resources, and I will be asking ministers to be having this in their roadmap. We need to improve our trade balance. We need to beef up our policy for export, and we will be going back on each of these sectors, and even though we're already doing a lot, the French trade balance is not good, and we know this. Why? Well, first of all, because we have energy dependency. That's a fact. And now, for all those who think that the strategy of decarbonization of France is a progressive delusion, those who want to improve the carbon footprint and improve our trade dependency, the goal is we have to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. So we don't have them, they're expensive. So decarbonization is the best way, one of the best ways of improving our trade balance. Second, we have sectors where we still have huge potential for exports. Our agri-food sector is driven by the jewels in the crown, spirits, others, but we can do far more in health, energy, sustainable cities, the tech sector. They all have export potential is very significant, and I want there to be a strategy by a sector. Go through all the countries. This work has already been done, but we need to go back on this, revisit this, do even better. And we also need to use all of our instruments. We've increased our overseas development aid. We have credits, whatever may be the involvement, the commitment of the AFD, but what we need to do is to evaluate everything that has been done in recent years, and I cannot say that it's always a success when we look at some of the very expensive projects that we finance with French public operators that enable Chinese private operators to roll out their offering. I think we need to resynchronize things here at home. So let's see what the return on investment is for our own companies, for our own sectors. There's no fatalism here. And I think that in the area of rare resources, which is where we are, and we're going to remain there, we need to mobilize all our financing channels to maximize the impact. And to succeed in this prosperity strategy, we need to diversify our partnerships. Now, I won't be exhaustive here, but we have growth partnerships on which I want us to reinvest. First of all, our British friends will be holding a new Franco-British summit for a renewal of the Lancaster House strategy treaty, and I think with our British friends we need to do even more. And the second thrust is Europe. I was talking about the European Economic Community with strategic goals, but there's huge untapped potential that we have to mobilize here. Let's be clear about this. The last enlargement, France benefited far less from the enlargement than our German neighbors. We were not as well organized. We were less determined. Now, Europe brought together that 700 million inhabitants and consumers. It's relatively homogeneous in terms of inhabitants and consumers, so it's an area of growth. So in the CPE, we need to have a partnership for strategy.
The Indo-Pacific over and beyond strategic issues, and I've said this over the years, is of course a priority. France has a voice of its own. We've built a consistent strategy there. We've made it a European strategy, but that strategy has made it possible for a number of states to be independent from China without entering into conflict. And therein lies the beauty of the third party. We're not submitted to Chinese interests. We do have overseas territories, but we're not entering in any kind of confrontation, unlike the United States of America. We have huge potential in the Indo-Pacific, and this has made it possible for us to have historic defense contract, the largest of the past 10 years, much bigger in terms of return on investment, much more than the AUKUS contract, where we had a reversal, is the contract we have with the United Arab Emirates. This is a strategic and defense contract, but over and beyond the United Arab Emirates, we have agreements with Qatar, India, Indonesia, and indeed with many countries in the region. We have an ability to have a presence in Djibouti, and that means that the Indo-Pacific, we have still huge potential, not just for our own prosperity, but for, as I said, for the defense industry, which is why, by the way, I will be at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore in the spring and be visiting other countries as well. In South America, we have former affinities. We should find mutually beneficial agreements. We need to build our growth strategy there, and that means with Brazil under President Lula, we need to consolidate what we did with Argentina in the previous years. And the driving thread there is to have we have to look at a decarbonized industry and looking at critical metals as well. We'll be consolidating the agreements with South America. In most of the countries there, we have consistent strategies there, very much in line with our own, and we have an agreement on securing the supply of rare materials and also decarbonized growth with Brazil. We have cross and mutual investments. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a case in point last year, but we have trusted partners with whom we share many opportunities. So we have a prosperity agenda, new partnerships, and this is why I would like to mention the African continent. And here, I should like to show gratitude for all the fine work you've been conducting there. African agenda must get out of obsessions of the past. I've taken a hard look at historical issues, cultural, memorial issues, and I believe we've done hard work, not just in Africa. In Algeria, we had the Story Commission and the Story Report. We've been returning works of art, and that is the Ouagadougou agenda that I mentioned earlier. So over the past few years, we've really changed things around. We have a new approach. France has been looking at its past, has taken a hard look at its past and tried to have a scientific, historiographical approach an uninhibited approach, and we'll be doing the same with Cameroon. We have historians working there as well. But in my capacity as President of the Republic, born after decolonization in the continent, where 75% of the population is under the age of 25, the dialogue with Africa can be held hostage to a form of post-colonial Pan-Africanism with turning us into the new imperialists. We cannot have this sort of a false dialogue with false intellectuals that are manipulating the social media, taking advantage of the stress of the younger generation with the complicity of the likes of Russia and China. No, we have to say that France's presence in history is being in Africa is not being wiped away. It's being revisited. We've decided to move in Africa. We decided to take a new stand because we had to take a new stand. We looked at our past relation in memorial terms, in cultural terms. We've looked at the facts, we've been accepting the facts, but we are not giving in to disinformation. Number two, we had a security relationship with Africa. It was a dual relation. Part of it was our commitment against terrorism ever since 2013. We've been fighting alongside Africa. We did the right thing. Nobody said thank you, but of course, thanks will come later. I'm well used to this. Ungratefulness is unfortunately a human disease. But believe you me, had it not been for our French servicemen, some of whom actually give up their lives for this combat, many of these countries, many of these governments would have been overrun. Wherever you have coups, where new governments saying our priority is no longer fighting terrorism but this or that, well then France had nothing to do because we cannot be the second knives of the purchased of these new dictators. Otherwise, we would have been holding our own post-colonial discourse, because in French-speaking Africa, there was a history, we had a military presence, but of course, that was no longer justified. That was not France's presence. The interests were no longer there, and instead of being recognized for what it was being used against us. They said, look, the French have a camp with 2,000 soldiers, they are fomenting some coup, and so disinformation was being used against us. And so, patiently, and I would like to thank Jean-Marie Bockel in a personal capacity. I would like to thank him for this mission because he is one of those who actually suffered himself from this situation. But he worked with the ministers, with the military establishment. And so what we told the African heads of state was that we should reorganize. Because we are being polite, we let them make the announcement first. But just because we're being polite and we're organizing, we shouldn't be construed as being kicked out of Africa. In fact, many of these countries didn't want France to leave, didn't want even us to reorganize. But that is what a partnership is all about. So yes, we are starting a new defense partnership. We will have new bases, and Djibouti is a case in point. That will be stable. This will be lasting because it's a regional presence, and we'll ask our partners to express their defense expectations and requirements. There will be much more work in terms of information, communication, equipment, and this will also mean more defense contracts. It will be for us to qualify to define the new threats, as we did with Benin a few years. This is a completely novel relationship. We started a strategic dialogue with the likes of Nigeria. And so, again, it's this uninhibited defense dialogue. But of course, over and beyond defense, Africa is a continent of growth. And again, we are being too cautious about this. We are obsessed with French-speaking Africa. Fair enough. We have history, we have relations, and including in civil society. That's all very well. But thank God we went to Nigeria for the first. It was the first trip in 25 years. 150 million inhabitants. Thank God we went to Kenya. That was our first visit in many years as well. Good thing we returned to Ethiopia. More than 100 million people there. We have a strategy of investment. We have to change our take on Africa. This is a continent with huge emerging economies, with huge economic potential. And in some parts, we actually disinvesting. We are divesting from Africa at a time when we should, in fact, reinvest. And of course, investment should be there to support the risk we are taking, but we have to be major players. We need to have a strategy with our entrepreneurs in all industries. That strategy has got to be much more ambitious vis-à-vis the African continent. This is a continent of opportunity in commercial, in economic terms, on the matter of food and agriculture, even on cultural, artistic matters, sporting events. We have the expertise. We've displayed this to the entire world during the Olympics and Paralympics. The sporting strategy has got to be rolled out in Africa because, of course, the people who worked for the Games should also work for the Cup of Nations in Africa. And we also have expertise to bring in terms of education and the like. And so we've started changing our take in Ouagadougou, but that has got to be replicated elsewhere. This is a new conquest that we have to start. But some people refuse to understand, refuse to move because we are challenging their vested interests. And yet, that change is a good thing because the world is changing and we have to embrace this new partnership. And speaking of the African continent, and this is something we need to do with North Africa, one of the great moments of the past few months has been what we achieved, what we were able to build in Morocco with His Majesty Mohammed VI. You may remember we went there a few weeks ago. We've built a partnership for the decades to come. This is completely novel. This is unprecedented, and this really will lay the foundation of our new approach. Indeed, this should be what will carry our own new African approach. We will have Franco-Moroccan projects throughout the African continent. That's a new way of approaching the continent, take a new look on France if we are being seen as partners. So North Africa, Maghreb, will be part of this strategy, and this is at the heart of the positive agenda. The Maghreb agenda, the fund of talents, and even though there may be remaining tensions, we need to have such an agenda. And then this prosperity agenda has got to be defined in terms of partnerships overseas. And I've said this before, we have failed collectively. This is an organizational issue maybe, but we were not able to put the French archipel at the heart of considerations. People think, well, France is just mainland France, but we have many overseas territories, and this is our great expansion. Of course, we're a centralized country, but even in these overseas territories, people look to Paris. But that is no way of expanding our economic presence. We need to have a regional strategy for our overseas territories. That started 7 years ago. We had the overseas departments, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs should also work with our network of ambassadors to develop that regional approach. And I'm delighted to see that Martinique joined CARICOM in the Indian Ocean. We are now members of the Indian Ocean Commission. It will be next for Mayotte to join. We also worked with the South Pacific community, with the FIP. And so we were able to get a foothold in these organizations, of which we had been absent for so many years. But now, in all industries, we need to work with all countries of the sub-region. We need to have a strategy with sport, with Jamaica on sports. That's a good idea. In terms of tourism, we can certainly address that challenge, working with not just Mayotte, but the entire sub-region. Again, there are positive challenges ahead. In French Polynesia, we can also work with that sub-region, and we have to step up these efforts. We need to have an Amazon approach for Guyana, and that's exactly what we're doing with Brazil. So this is a huge potential for our countrymen to return to these territories. The outlook is completely turned around, and I should like to thank our forces who went to Mayotte to address the disaster there, but we have remaining challenges in terms of migration in particular. We'll need to have a strong cooperation with our neighbors, including the Comoros. There are always easy words spoken against the Comoros, but things are always more complicated than they look. But also, again, if we want to achieve a result, we have to have a strong, demanding dialogue, but a respectful dialogue as well. And these will be my closing words. After having protected, ensured prosperity in our country and the continent, we need to have clear ambitions, and there remain challenges ahead. We have to be able to act jointly, and France has a special role to play in Europe on climate change, health, food, finance, and the defense of democracy. Climate first, I was saying the Paris agreements was signed 10 years ago. They've been threatened. They were threatened in 2017 when President Trump announced that he was pulling out. But things are even more serious today, to be candid. President Trump has been threatening to pull out of these agreements, but he's also talking about redeploying fossil fuels and developing that in neighboring countries as well. And there's been a major misunderstanding on that with South America and Africa on fossil fuels. The idea is that somehow these countries shouldn't be allowed to develop their fossil fuel-based economies. Of course, this is a major misunderstanding, and France has got to be clear on this. For instance, Brazil has got to make the COP30 a successful event in Berlin. We, of course, we are aiming at carbon neutrality, but the big agenda on which all our efforts should be focused is pulling out of coal as quickly as possible for emerging economies. And this is something we need to do. We're not there giving lectures or pointing fingers. We need to have agreements with these emerging economies. You remember the jet piece. But that is the strategy with the greatest impact on climate. If you want to turn things around, we need to step up China's coal peak, but we have to help India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others help these countries pull out of coal, help South Africa in its transition, etc. And so this is where we will focus our diplomatic and investment efforts. It will be for us to run the One Planet Summit with new alliances, and I do believe in the strength of such alliances with all stakeholders over and beyond the Belém COP30 in Brazil. We will need to have clear alliances with financiers, with industrialists, with all the territories, so that we can have and claim specific achievements. And then we will continue the biodiversity agenda. France has carried that agenda for the past few years. We were able to build biodiversity credits. Well, it took time to gain a foothold, but the one thing that is definitely efficient is to have a carbon approach to biodiversity, and so the complete agenda is the agenda that will be carried by France in all these venues, but it will be also for us in France, in Nice, in June, to host the UN conference on oceans, and that will be a major event for climate, biodiversity, and the issue of oceans. Our oceans are a clear carbon sink, a huge biodiversity reserve, a continent of research has got to be entirely invented. There are huge and unprecedented opportunities, but it's also a space of conflicts. And so that UN conference will be a defining event, and I'm calling on all the diplomatic network to be mobilized for this Nice event, and we have a number of objectives. We'll be visiting them in the months to come. But one thing is for sure, we need to have a research organization, the Ocean IPCC, if I may say so. We need to ratify the High Water Treaty. This was one of France's achievements over the past few months, and I'd like to thank those that made it possible to make this happen. But 60 countries need to ratify the treaty, and so we have to mobilize to get the ratifications in Nice. That will be a defining event for the high seas. And then the failure of Busan was on plastics. We need to get an agreement, at least on the Mediterranean, on the large area that is within our ambitions. That was one of the main objectives. That's for climate. On health and food, we know that is, of course, an interest for humanity as a whole. We've been reinvesting on multilateral funds in the World Health Organization. Over the past few years, we've shown the strength of the WHO Academy. That is where research is being conducted here in France. But there remain challenges in terms of food and health. France needs to defend the concept of credits, but the path it should follow is that of a free and open research. The major risk in the international agenda is that of the US pulling out of the WHO and having the debate being confiscated, and some of the organizers are reneging on the rules, are complicating the issue, reducing visibility. But we should draw the lessons of the pandemic. We need to have more effective detection mechanisms. We need to have independence vis-à-vis diplomatic pressure. We should be able to pursue the agenda. Of course, food and health go hand in hand. And in March, there will be the Nutrition for Growth Summit, which should give clear results in fighting child mortality. But of course, there's a clear link between climate, biodiversity, health, and food. This One Health strategy was designed in the midst of the pandemic, and in fact there will be a summit this year that will help mobilize all the instruments that were created precisely for this form of effective multilateralism. And so we will have to double down on our efforts in terms of health and food at a time where tensions between China and America are making things very tense indeed, at a time when the US is threatening to pull out. And of course, the third big pillar is revisiting the international financial architecture. The big risk there is to see the world being completely fragmented. Ever since we pulled out of World War II, we had the International Monetary Fund, we had the World Bank, but now that is becoming obsolete. Because the rules of investment, representativeness simply did not take into account the major emerging economies. And of course, China is trying to circumvent these commitments, and also there's great tension, a dual standard that is being maintained by the crisis in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. And because of that, there's talk of creating a new global south that should simply pull out of all this, because that organization is a strictly Western organization. Of course, what we need to come up with is rules that are more fair, that are more respectful, more effective. But if we still need to have a sound international financial order. We laid the foundations for that at the African Summit in 2021. In 2023, there was this big summit on new financial international financial principles. As many as 60 countries around the world attended this. Well, that momentum should be pursued because we need to be able to achieve the four Ps of that compact. What is it about? The idea is not to have to choose between development, economic opportunities on the one hand, and fighting climate change. We shouldn't lecture anyone, and we shouldn't tell countries you should give up on growth for the sake of the climate. Then the second principle is each country should draw its own path. We can't have a one-size-fits-all on these matters. Each country should have its own national strategy. Number three, what we call concessional assistance. This has got to be a public effort. Of course, you have countries that can invest. We should pool the resources of our banks, and indeed that's happening. We have the French Development Agency, AFD, is working with all its partners around the world, and all the multilateral development banks are, and indeed regional development banks are working. But this will be a chance also to consider the resources of the IMF and the World Bank. And then number four, the private sector. When all these players come together, indeed that has been started by the World Bank, but that is how we were able to have a special drawing rights worth more than several billion just for African countries. Were paid out of STDs in the IMF, which means that this is where cooperation should continue. But we need to have more countries joining. We need to have countries joining the new agenda that is being drawn up. We have this new roadmap being drawn up, and during the next G7 in 2026, this will come under the aegis of France. It will be for us to have this new international financial order. And we will consider all these matters at the Council of Ministers of Finance in March. And then finally, defending democracy and universalism. 25 years have passed that have shed many illusions. 25 years ago, we thought that democracy was bound to prevail. That was the end of history, and everything was fine with the world. Well, it was a hard awakening, and that awakening didn't start now, but we shouldn't, 25 years down the road, come against the opposite idea. It looks as though now nobody wants to defend the rule of law, democracy. Democracy is no longer fashionable, and there's a kind of sinister fascination for the international community of reactionaries. Of course, they're very powerful, they've got money, and indeed we find an acceleration of that reactionary movement involving major private financial interests, and that is the result of something that is undeniable. Our liberal democracies were not effective enough to address the challenges facing the middle class. I know this for a fact, and I've been doing my best with successes and failures over the past few years. But just because liberal democracy isn't effective enough to address the issues of migration or the economy, its simplification, or this or that, this doesn't mean that dictatorship should be any more effective. And that's what's happening nonetheless. Some people live in their fantasy. Some people think, say goodbye to climate change. If you want the economy to go, you have to give up on all this. Well, but if we decide to renege on climate change, we will degrade our own financial, economic performance, our own trade performance. Those who believe that the independence of judges, journalists is an impediment to the effectiveness of governance, just try and see who was the most effective during the pandemic. It was the democracies. It was tough, but it was the democracies that prevailed. There were always people from all quarters telling us what we should do. It was very tiring, but at the end of the day, you had scientists recognized by their peers explaining the science, and people challenging the government. Sometimes sometimes the government is being challenged in court, and sometimes the government loses. But democracy is by and large, and indeed by a long way, more effective than non-liberal or regimes or dictatorships. When you have a big problem in these countries, things don't go well.
This may seem self-evident. We recall this everywhere, and we have to build a determined agenda for defense, democracy, universalism, separation of powers, the value of liberal democracy, and the fundamental principles, gender equality, protection of minorities, counterbalancing powers, and checks and balances. And it's not because sometimes we're not efficient in settling problems that we have to give up on our principles. It's quite the contrary. We have to be far more efficient in upholding these principles, because that's ultimately is what we're fighting for. And everything I've said before would have no meaning if what we want ultimately is to resemble Russia. Then why continue to? This is the paradox of this reactionary international, which seems to be fascinating everyone. And if you look more closely at immigration, if you look more closely at Russia on the social media, do they all think the same thing? And no, in fact, quite. So we'll have seen everything in this respect, and this is why I'm asking you to have a diplomatic effort that continues to uphold the cause of women around the world, with the Marianne initiative that we will pursue to support democracy, with the initiatives that we've had in Africa with Professor Membe, the emergence of a new generation for democracy with young African leaders that we will continue to roll out, the support for the information and democracy partnership at the UN that we will continue, the States General for training, États Généraux, which will lead to a law that we have to uphold internationally. And in fact, I have a piece of good news for you. All these people have said that there's a uniform way of thinking, and that in actual fact, the uniform way of thinking is now the reactionary way of thinking. So this means that we have huge potential, and where somehow we had fallen asleep, well, this is a wake-up call for us. I don't want a uniform reactionary way of thinking that explains to us that renouncing democratic values, which are set out in the preamble to our constitution, or giving up on gender equality would be a good thing. So I call on our diplomatic networks to continue with these efforts in Georgia for all those who fought for elections, with the very brave president, the very brave demonstrators, and fighting for transparency to be established, and even if that means new elections. In Venezuela, where we must not be complacent or defeatist about the 10th of January being self-evident, we need to continue to support those who are being so brave in fighting for pluralism, for democracy, and to fight for new elections to be held, and to do this with all the partners in the region, and to fight alongside all fighters for freedom. Professors, writers, journalists, when they're jailed. We've always done this and will continue to do so. And I have a very special thought for a freedom fighter, a Franco-Algerian writer, Boualem Sansal, who is being detained in a completely arbitrary manner by the Algeria's leaders. We have so much in common with Algeria in terms of history, our children, and preventing a sick man to have access to medical care. This really is not worthy of them, and we do a call for the immediate release of Boualem Sansal. Yes, freedom means democracy, and therefore we have to continue to uphold these values everywhere with respect. Sometimes we'll have to do this behind closed doors when that's the most effective way of doing things. We need to do this strongly, and freedom is what we will continue to uphold for all our fellow citizens around the world, for hostages wherever they may be held. And this is why I'm very happy that we're able to release some of them at the end of last year, and we'll continue to fight for the release of all of our hostages who are held in Iran in a totally undignified, unacceptable way. So I will not go any further, ladies and gentlemen. Ensuring our prosperity, doing our duty to protect ourselves from the disorder of the world. That's the policy for the year ahead. And with renewed wishes, diplomacy is only valuable if it's the armor of the countries it serves. And this is what we'll have to do for all our compatriots, wherever they may be, wherever they may live, wherever they're from. I've tried to set out a clear direction of what our agenda will be for the year ahead, and to do this so that all our fellow citizens have in mind how much the key challenge is at the very heart of our day-to-day efforts in diplomacy. So I want to thank you all for your commitment, for your the fight that you're waging. I want to thank all the special envoys, all our partners, the members of the government who are also seeking to build this agenda. Long live the Republic, long live France.